Hello and welcome to the 11th and final episode of Season 4 of the Anna Asks podcast. I'm so pleased to bring this one to your ears and also let you know about what's coming next month. So as we come around to July, we'll be kicking off Season 5. Season 5 takes on a new theme, similar format with interviews but a new theme, asking how do people who work in the pregnancy, birth, postpartum and perinatal spaces actually prepare for these times when it's their own turn to have a baby. So if you haven't heard yet, I am expecting my second child, and I've invited a whole lot of wonderful guests across midwifery, doulas, perinatal mental health support, all different professions to come and share how this time is playing out for them, what they are prioritising, and what their gold nuggets of wisdom would be for those who are traversing their path with their first or subsequent children. Before I go too far, I do want to mention that I finally have the podcast supporter feature set up properly for this podcast. So if you would like to chip in $2.99 Australian a month, you can do so via the link in the show notes here. That will go towards all the editing and hosting costs and all those sorts of things that I have been covering myself. And I would very much appreciate that if you have change to spare. Today's conversation with Bridget Wood has been in the works for many months. I know it will strike a chord for, I'd say, just about everyone here, because we can't get around the fact that we do have pangs of resentment. We do have that feeling like our partner is just never going to get it. If you have a partner on the scene, this is going to hit home for you. It's not always going to be comfortable what Bridget has to say, but we do traverse a whole lot of territory, when to stay, when to go, and how to have hard conversations with someone who is really unwilling to come to the table. At the end, you'll hear about Bridget's reimagining motherhood membership. And remember as well, my motherhood support sessions are on offer on a pay-as-you-can basis. I'd also like to acknowledge that we do refer to concepts like the perfect mother myth in this episode. That comes from the work of Dr. Sophie Brock, who Bridget and I have both had the pleasure of learning from and with. If you head back to Season 1, Episode 24 of this podcast, you'll be able to hear those concepts explored in more detail and see how to connect with her directly. All right, let's dive in. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Anna Asks podcast. I'm your host, Anna Cusack, and today I am speaking with Bridget Wood. So Bridget Wood is a mother of 3 and a mentor for whole, embodied living and loving, a masterful facilitator. Bridget creates spaces and conversations designed to raise collective consciousness. She embodies authentic leadership, activism, and empowered motherhood. Bridget's work will revolutionize the way you approach your life and your beliefs. Her powerful, transformative online programs and long-running Nourishing the Mother podcast are sought out by women across the globe. And I am one of those women that have sought Bridget out on multiple occasions for group support and private conversations too, and spent much of particularly my first year of motherhood with a lot of pushing prams and baby carrier sleeps with Nourishing the Mother in my ears, which was a really lovely thing to have, that conversation and company in times that can otherwise feel very lonely. So before we really get started and say hello to Bridget, I do want to acknowledge that I'm recording this podcast on the lands of the Awabakal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and remind all of us that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And Bridget, where are you recording today?
I'm recording from the land of the Bunurong people.
Wonderful, thank you. So I've given you a bit of an introduction there. I'm going to get you to introduce yourself as well, but before I do that, I just want to explain why it was that I asked you to come on to record this episode today. So a while ago, probably late 2021, early 2022, I wrote a post or a piece that was titled, "We Send Mothers to Therapy and Tell Fathers to Step Up, when what we actually need is fathers in therapy and mothers stepping back." And this was one of the most popular things that I have written, and I received a lot of agreement, but was also posed with the question a lot of times, well, what do I actually do if he won't go to therapy? How can I step back when he refuses to rise because he's in his own trauma loops and wounds and triggers and all of these things? So you are the best person that I can think of to dig into this conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think I'm still, first of all, I'm still caught back with where you were talking about that year of motherhood, that first year, and that like sense of listening to a conversation where you could feel a sense of connection. And I was like, oh my God, I created what I always wanted. Because I remember pushing my firstborn in a pram and just feeling such a shell of myself, so broken, so like disconnected, that I just yearned for what I know Nourishing the Mother to be for mothers. So thank you for that experience. Like it was almost like a real big connection point for me, actually, to see you reflect on your time listening in that season of motherhood, and then me seeing that season of motherhood for me with my first baby, and how much I felt like it broke me. It broke me open and it helped me rise, but that first 6 months, it really felt like it broke me open.
Yeah. And that's the experience for so many of us. And you've been doing this with Julie a really long time. 6 years now?
7 years, yeah.
7 years, yeah. And these are weekly episodes. Like the archive that you've created together is something that you can really dip into whatever topic it is that is on your mind and on your heart right now, and be open to wider ways of looking at those things. So thank you.
Yeah. And from there, I guess too, I was thinking about that isolation. I'm thinking about part of that isolation, I think, was also that I felt like my husband and I were on two different planets, right? Like I've had this monumental identity shift where I've let go of everything it was that I was, like, professional woman, independent, dual breadwinner, defined myself by so much of my work and that contribution that I was making to the world. And then here I am with this baby at home and this husband who's working enormous hours and who loves this child, but really hasn't had the journey that I've had to get here. And I remember that first year being so like wobbly in myself, wobbly in my relationship, because I didn't even know how to ask to be seen in a way that wasn't pleading and desperate.
Yeah.
Which for a man whose nervous system can't handle that, if we've never trained our partner into being able to meet that, because we've always been so self-sufficient and so equal, it's really hard. Like it's hard for a relationship to traverse that.
It is very much related to this social idea that we've been educated into for our lives. Our generation is perhaps the first, or at least one of the first, that is being told, like, yes, you are equal, you do have equal opportunity in the workplace, and whether that's actually true or not, but you have equal right to education, you have equal capacity. And then when a baby arrives, you realize that actually, at least for a period of time, that's not true. That's not how our biology works. It's not how our social leave systems in this country are set up. It's very different trajectories from the start. And I've spoken about this before, but there was a period that I was having great difficulty with feeding and sleeping and things around. My daughter was around 3.5 months old, and at the time my partner got really sick, and we lived separately for a week. I moved to my parents' house, and by the end of that week, I pretty much thought that like we were going to be up for divorce. I was like, how you're never going to understand what has changed even in the last week. How can you possibly catch up to me as a parent? I'd be better off just doing this on my own. And you say that your husband was working very long hours, and I imagine what it is like for people whose partners work away for much of the year, or fly in, fly out, or travel often for work, or are deployed in the military for 6 months. Like, how do we not hate them, basically?
Yeah, it's a good question. And certainly, I mean, it's funny because we did a podcast on resentment actually last week in Nourishing the Mother. And for me,
I specifically didn't go and listen to that one so that I didn't lead you down a certain path of exploring the exact same questions.
Yeah, it's really alive in me at the moment because it's striking such a chord with so many women. I think a fundamental thing that has shifted my understanding of my husband is how we cannot ever possibly see things the same, because we have different ways of seeing the world. We have different things that drive us. We have different things that light us up. We have different things that interest us. And I think for so much of my relationship, I would spend time trying to make him like what I liked, or try to self-righteously project onto him, my way of seeing things, or that we should do things this way. And in doing that, I was minimizing the value that he was bringing. I was unable to see it because I was so focused on my way being the way we were going, right? And so it was deeply humbling to me to learn to take a step back a little and look at his experience, his world, his capacity, and not make that mean anything about me, which is one of the hardest things, because particularly if we feel like we're flailing, we need someone else to be able to step up. We need someone else to be able to hold us, but they have a nervous system too. They have an identity transformation going on too, but it's because men typically don't articulate it in the way that women do and process it inwardly, so it doesn't almost look like anything's happening. We can miss it and be so caught up in our experience that we don't see theirs, which creates us to push more onto them and, nag and all of this kind of stuff, which then has them withdraw, which was certainly my experience. And then you end up with this arrangement where there's, a big lack of connection, lack of understanding, and a lack of desire for intimacy, which is a key thing to, help a relationship thrive. So I see now parenting and raising children as an invitation to up-level my relationship. And I see my relationship as work and something separate that requires nurturing and requires putting into. And that, as frustratingly as it might seem, because often women have, this is a generalization, but the more feminine energy in a relationship typically has the pulse for, the pulse on kind of the flow of love or the flow of connection. So we, the more feminine being within the relationship will be the one who will feel more quickly out of connection or feel more quickly like they're not being seen. And so we are the ones to go, hey, I don't feel met. You're not seeing me. You're not like acknowledging me. And then the work there is like, well, how do I help them understand it in a way that makes sense for them? Because I can't keep throwing this, see me, see my struggle at a nervous system that's also trying to deal with a struggle, and expect them to go, yes, show me it all. That they're required, it's a dance. And that dance actually has for us been, an experience of deepening and expanding our relationship in ways that I don't think that we could have got to had we not become parents. So in all the ways that it's kind of taken us to the edge, it's also taken us to more potential. But it's very much predicated on two people being, having enough values that overlap. So we both have a really high value on family. So my husband is extremely focused on our family, but it just looks slightly different to me and in the expression, right? So I have a high value on conscious parenting and respectful relating, and my husband's great at it, but it's not as high for him. So I have to be aware he'll show his love or connection in different ways, and it won't be the language necessarily that he uses with our children. And as long as I can see where he's showing up and looking for where his love is, and looking for that part of him that wants to provide, and I'm not in this place of he's not doing, he can't, he won't, I'm able to see more of him, and not the narrative that I keep running, which is that he's not enough, or he can't meet me, or look at all of my struggles. Because I think for many of us, we can carry this mental load so big that we almost don't even know how to hand it over, or we've decided I'm too terrified to hand it over in case something falls, so I'm just going to do it all myself, which is hard because then we've created a cage for ourselves as well. We've created this place where we kind of want help but don't want help because we're worried that the help isn't going to be at the level of provision that we want, and so we're in a bind, which is awful, because then we feel so stifled in our parenting, we feel stifled in our life experience, we feel isolated from them. And the biggest thing is for me, like, curiosity. Am I asking for what I need? Am I willing to validate what I need? Like, do I think it's okay for me to ask for this space and this time? Because if I don't, then they're not giving it to me either, because I'm not actually claiming that. I'm not saying I need you to do this, and not feel an ounce of guilt that I'm handing over the things that, say, the perfect mother myth might say is your job, right?
There's so many pieces to pick up and detangle further from what you just said. One thing you said quite early in that piece, your monologue, which was exceptional, by the way.
Sorry, I wasn't a roll.
You
haven't interrupted me yet, so I'll keep going.
Didn't want to interrupt you because I knew there would be more gold in there, but now we'll try and pick back to some of those separate pieces. You used a word early on, which was flailing, and us feeling like we're flailing. And I think that there is a social norm wired into all of us that mothers are naturally better at this than fathers are. And by this, I mean parenting. So unless we are able to express, actually, this is just as much a struggle for me as it is for you, I also have no idea what I'm doing, then they're not going to have any idea that it's hard for us, because their conditioning has told them that even if they find it hard, we must automatically be finding it a step easier than that.
And I think on that point too, they go through an experience of feeling often pretty useless in the beginning. My husband articulated that. He's like, well, our baby needs you, like, you're its life source, right?
That's it.
I feel pretty useless here. I mean, he was amazing and cooked so much food for me, like, and when he was home in those first few weeks, but that was all he felt like he could really do, because so much else relied upon me. And so there can be a disempowerment for men in that feeling of uselessness.
Yeah, and I think until it's framed as the idea that the mother is the life support for the baby, but the partner is the life support for the mother. And if they can see that each person is being a life support for this family, then that's even a powerful step in those early weeks. But a lot of us are coming to this conversation now when, I have friends who didn't come home from the hospital until day 5 after birth, and their partner went back to work at day 10 full time. Like, it's something that we're coming to, in some senses, years later, and these dynamics can be pretty set in stone. So you mentioned we have to look for, or we can look for, where places where our values meet and ways that they are meeting or providing or living in accordance with those values that looks different to how we would prefer it to be. So can you maybe explore that a little more for us, please?
Yeah, I think a great way to imagine this is like a Venn diagram. So you want enough overlap that there's cohesion, so enough overlap in those kind of two circles that the big things you're on the same page with. So you might both desire, certain kinds of outcomes or life experiences for your children, but you might have different ideas of how to get there. And so the work is how to each create space to listen and dialogue around those different ideas of how to get there in a way that still respects each other. And so, for us early on, this would look like talking about parenting styles and talking about, my husband's not really one to sit down on the ground and be with the intensity of the aggression of my children when they're totally dysregulated. And so I really occupy that space quite well. But he's a genius, and it's like he's learned by osmosis every playful parenting technique I've ever read and learned. And so he takes that space of coming in when I'm depleted and does stuff that is creative in ways that I couldn't imagine to be. And because he knows that
you're essentially saying that, like, you can hold them in their feelings and their distress, your children, but
yes,
your partner will then not have to read a parenting book to know that wrestling before bed is what this child needs to get their energy out.
Yeah. Or that, my youngest now, who's a bit like playing preferences with parents, he knows the way to meet her is with play and with contingency games where kind of he hides and she has to find him. And, I haven't told him that that's actually psychologically beneficial, but he's watched what I've done enough, and he's built relationships in such a way with the children enough to understand that that's what they need. So that's his literacy. If I'm spending all my time projecting onto him my literacy of holding feelings and understanding their aggression, then I'm denying where his genius already is in showing up. And so what I found most powerful is to look at whatever I think is missing in him or in, where he shows up for me. Well, first of all, where is it? Like, what form is it already here? It's in the play. And as long as I deny the fact that it's in the play and wish it was my way, I'm going to be frustrated, angry, resentful, disconnected, and out of appreciation. And all of that energetic muck in my body is going to be felt by him. Even if I don't say a word, he's going to feel it. And then depending on his nervous system and his capacity to meet, the feminine and like the intensity that can come from us when we're wild and angry, he'll either rise and hold us, or he'll withdraw into work, which was what he did. He would come home at 10 o'clock some nights. Massive projects, yes, but also there's a part of him that probably liked to hide in that because that felt safer than meeting, my flailing inability to function well, right?
I'm so glad you came around to that work example, because that was something that is coming up time and time again, is saying I need my husband to be more than a paycheck. Whereas in the male breadwinner model, which is the most common one in families in this country, the job description for dads is really like bring home the money and eventually teach your kids to drive. Yeah. So your earlier example was that his provision for your family is in his play, but for a lot of the people who have been interacting with some of my content, it's around he's actually just not there at all, and I don't want a bank balance, I want a partner. So if that's the place we're coming from, where do we start to look and converse?
And I just have so much compassion for how isolating that is for a mother, and how much she doesn't feel seen, right? Like it's so hard to be seen by somebody who's not really even there.
And it's so hard as well because we can be aware that they are avoiding parenting because it is bringing up all of their childhood things. And this is where it goes like, just go to therapy and sort this out.
Yeah.
But that refusal.
And the refusal because there's a denial. Yeah. And this is an interesting one because there is a cohort, I think, definitely of men who feel much safer just to lose themselves in their work than look at that, than understand that. And I think the why for many men has to be big enough to do that work. And I would be looking closely at what their childhood dynamics are, what their current relationship is with their parents, and try, when they're resistant, to get them to orient toward longer term thinking about the kind of relationship that they want to have with their children, because that has been the focal point of my orienting my husband back into the vulnerability of connection, when I can see him getting pulled into that, punitive kind of, well, they just have to kind of imprint that I know he comes with, and that, really most of us come with.
That like those children just have to behave. They have to follow my direction.
Yeah, which that only ever comes from him when he's depleted, or triggered, right? Because when you're centered, you see your child as a whole person and not somebody that you need to control, right? But all of us, when we are exhausted, when we are, not in our prefrontal cortex, if we're way back in those earlier responses, which our children will put us in because they're designed to take us to levels of our own emotional development that are kind of stunted. Right? That's kind of what happens with parenting.
Back to our survival brain and our
survival brain.
Childhood age of 3 or 5 or 9 or whatever, not with our full adult capacities to put all the pieces together.
Yeah. And so helping them to, having conversations when they're not triggered about it, around, what do you really want? Like, what do you want for our family? What do you want for the kind of relationship with that, with our children? Like, what do you see us as doing as they grow? So that, and then help them work back to, well, what needs to be in place now, or what kind of practice do we want to have now for cultivating that? If we want our children to feel safe in their bodies and safe in their expression, well, then what do we need to do in this environment that they're bathing in to make that possible? Because it's not something that we just get to decide when they're 8 or 9 and we realize that they're not confident in school or they don't want to speak up. Like, that gets laid down when they're toddlers. So what do you see as the biggest challenge for you right now? And, notice if they start to going, well, they just won't and he just can't. And just like listen to your own activation, and listen to them as a person struggling with themselves, right? Because we are always meeting ourselves in parenting. We're meeting that inner part. And the tricky part is because so many women, also professional women, take on parenting almost as this other thing I'm going to dedicate myself to. I'm going to dedicate myself to understanding the brain, and I'm going to dedicate myself to understanding emotional needs. We take on board all of this, and our partners might maybe still stuck in a very mainstream paradigm of, in some families, children should be seen or not heard, or in some families, let's pit our child against each other and make them compete to make them better, right? Like there's still a lot of old paradigms that exist in terms of how we raise children. So I would be coming back to like your family vision, and also to what they need to be able to provide that, because this is where a lot of women get stuck, is they will feel like, well, he's already at work all of this time, he doesn't, why should he get to go and play golf with his friends or this, that, and the other? But those things, those bonding things, those opportunities where they're not responsible for anything and they're simply just being, for lots of men, help them bring more back into their family. Not all men, I'm going to say, but if we want more and more presence and more provision of, understanding, then it's also, how can you get your needs met? Because if you feel like you're losing yourself in work, or what you're turning into like a workaholic, then there's a need that's not being met. And it's going to continue to not be met if you keep using work as this thing that you're losing yourself in. Like, these are hard conversations. Like, these are not
because
easy.
it feels so unfair to say, what I need is spaciousness, and to do that I need to give you more space first. That seems like a really bitter pill to swallow, particularly when, as you said, we can listen, raise these conversations with our partner and listen to them say, well, they just need to, or you're ridiculous, or blah, blah. Because we've invested ourselves to parenting, now it feels like we're parenting them.
Yeah.
When you're holding their feelings the same as you hold your children's feelings, that same irrationality, that same they're acting 3 years old because that's where their emotional growth in this area got stopped by the way they were parented or raised, or had a traumatic event or whatever. It seems just like more work. Why would I even bother bringing this up?
Yeah. But the thing is, if you don't bring it up, then the resentment grows and the disconnection grows, and you end up, and this is another thing, right? Like, we also want to consider when these children are gone, like when they've left, what relationship do I want?
Yeah, I think that's a big one.
Because they're going to leave one day, and you're going to be left with everything that's unsaid and unexpressed. And what have you not put on the table?
I think that's where some people that I've been speaking with are at. It's kind of like, well, if I'm trying everything that I can to give the space and have these conversations, and I'm continually met with resistance and shutdown and further withdrawal and whatever I try, now I'm at a point of going, well, do I keep putting the effort into that with the hope that you have potential to expand, or do I walk away now instead of in 15 years' time when my youngest child leaves home? And neither of these are easy places to go.
No, they're not. And also, you've got to think about, well, what imprint am I giving my children on relationship as well? So there's you and what's your well-being. There's the kind of relational dynamic that your children grow in, which ends up being their blueprint for relationships. So we come with and often choose partners who reflect something to do with our own childhood imprint of relationship, which is tricky if we don't have a functional relational imprint. If we have lots of dysfunction in our relational imprint from our childhood, then it leads to us as adults trying to reconcile that dysfunction. Now, some people can choose to do that work, like the emptiness or the longing is big enough that they're choosing the work, which would be like my husband. So dad left and had made another family with another woman when he was, at the age of 7. So him and I were talking a lot about like what was coming up for him when our son was 7, because my husband's having a direct experience of the conflicting feelings in him of knowing his abandonment wound, like he's feeling it. And then he's having more anger at his dad, like, that's just surfaced after 40 years, 30 something, 40 years.
How could you leave me when this is how little I was?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that it requires an openness in your relationship to look at your childhood dynamics and to look at, because sometimes too, we think we have great childhoods and then we can become parents and then we go, oh my God, I have all this like trauma I didn't even
baggage,
know with me. I'm hitting this rage I never knew was there. because we're meeting these parts of our of our own inner child that we learned to repress in order to exist within the home environment that we were in. This is the stuff no one talks about in terms of parenting, right? Like you're parenting yourself, you're parenting your children, you're witnessing your partner regress back into their childhood and trying to parent. Like it's so much stuff. And depending on your value on family, depending on your value on relationship, you're going to have to make decisions about, are you willing to work for this?
I think bringing it back to the values, as you said, like if your Venn diagram of your values and your partner's values do cross over a lot, if those central ones are really strong, if that, it might be that regardless of the walls that they're putting up, that you feel like it will get there in time. But if your highest values are all outside of the crossover point, when you figure that out, either separately or together, that might be really hard to come back from.
Yeah, I mean, you can do things. I mean, remembering like neuroplasticity, it means that
that's true. Your values aren't consistently set in one place forever for life.
Yeah. And it also means, like, I mean, ultimately human behavior works in such a way that if somebody challenges your values enough, if somebody, takes your highest values and basically tramples all over them, there's only so much time you're going to spend there, because you are wired to, your identity is your top values and you are wired to protect that identity. So there'll only be so long that you stay there unless you can communicate effectively and help them understand your values and be able to put theirs enough aside or see how theirs serve yours as well.
Yeah, and I'm thinking as well, in that example of the partner who pulls back to work all the time, if you do a values activity with that kind of person to figure out what is going on at that point in time, they're probably going to list work as a top value, regardless of if it actually is a functional top value or not, or if it is a survival tactic for them. That's going to be, in their mind, it's going to be one of the most important things in their life, regardless of if deep down that is the case or not.
Yeah, I mean, our life demonstrates what we really value. So we can say it's one thing, but you look at someone's life and you see what it is. So we can't hide from what they are. And we often, kind of beat ourselves up thinking we should be something else, when in fact our life's demonstrating what's really important to us. So with a partner who is working all of the time and who is losing themselves in their work, yes, that may be quite possibly a form of, addiction. And addiction ultimately manifests, as sometimes a trauma response, sometimes as a compulsion or a, just a neural pathway that just likes getting that same kind of dopamine hit. And it can definitely come, and it's socially acceptable for it to be in the form of work for men. But that may also be as a result of a deep wound. And I think if we could understand the void for our partner of why it is that is their focus, then it can help us see beyond our resentment. So, for the man who grew up in an unstable home in poverty, then he may never feel like he can work enough to ever heal or soothe that inner child who was terrified of that instability, for example, because those big childhood voids tend to be so visceral that we almost can't do enough to fulfill them. Like, so mine is like connection. Like, it's almost like I sometimes can't feel enough connection to overcome that sense of lack of connection within myself as a child. So I know that is going to be constantly changing form, but is always going to be a value for me. So if my husband couldn't understand that and judged me for it and minimized my experience, then it would be really hard to relate to him, because a key part of my identity and who I am is reflected in that. So I would be looking at like what's beneath the work addiction, what's beneath that. And if it's hiding, see if you can open up a conversation about what it is they're hiding from. Is it a feeling of uselessness? Maybe they feel useless at home, but they feel really useful at work. So how could we make home a place where we actually really appreciate what they do to show up, and it's a place where they want to be?
And I think maybe seeing from that space, there are ways that you can adjust your behavior at times without even having those conversations. How can you notice and articulate the usefulness in areas to build their sense of competence, even in the most unwilling of people to actually explore and have these conversations? Because as you say, otherwise it's just our wounds clashing with their wounds, and you should be doing this, and you should be feeling this, and I should be this, just being projected everywhere.
Yeah, and you think you've got to put yourself in the position of being on the receiving end of that. And even though, like, full understanding to how it gets there, because, we're women, this is happening to women who feel desperate now, right? Like they feel depleted, desperate, unseen, unheard, undervalued,
sleep deprived for years, while also being in a position of financial dependence in a lot of cases because of the ways that our welfare system does not support mothers and single parents. It's a really difficult place to be. Sometimes
terrifying place to be. And so for then to hear me say, well, you need to appreciate them more, sounds like how ridiculous, right?
The first time I heard you say that, I pretty much wanted to find where you lived and
and like tear my hair
very
out.
rageful letters.
Right? But if we consider like taking out of it like all of our feelings about it and we're purely looking at a human behavior point of view, we go where we are rewarded. Our body takes the shape of what we're rewarded for as children, and then we play that out. So there's an aspect of, even though a part of me thinks that you just should do the dishes in the mornings, like as my husband does the dishes every morning before he goes to work, because he knows he's out all day and there's a lot to do. And so I feel like this is a really reasonable and appropriate balance of responsibilities, right, from a very feminist point of view. Now, I still really show him my appreciation for that, because even, yes, it's a fair division of labor, I still want him to know how much I'm grateful for that. Just like I want him to be grateful for me that he has clean clothes. So there's a real value here in giving appreciation so that that person feels like what they're doing is meaningful, because no one wants to do something that they feel is meaningless. It's the most soul-destroying thing. You know what it's like when you're in a job and you're doing a project that you know is going to get canned. It's so hard to find willingness to do that. So if our partner is begrudgingly doing things because they can feel us shooting daggers at them, is that kind of helping them want to keep contributing? Not really. They do it begrudgingly. If they do it and we show our appreciation for it, then it's an energy that they want to be in, and it's an energy that we want to be in and what feels good. So it's a bit of a shift from taking that very feminist lens of equality to, how do I want to feel in this relationship? How do I want to feel in this home? What do I need to give or highlight so that raises everybody up? A little bit like with my kids, like I really want them to all contribute, and I want them to contribute willingly without me having to ask them all of the time. And that's going to require lots of times where I feel like I want to like bang my head against a wall, because how many times do I have to ask this? And I know this leans back into the parenting your partner thing, which I don't recommend. But again, it's part of asking for what we need. How can I ask this person for what I really need in a way that they can understand? And nagging and screaming or yelling just registers often in people's brains as cognitive dissonance or noise. And what really speaks to somebody is when we look at what's important to them and we communicate it in that way, and we get into their world and help them see what we here over here in our world need from them and help them want to give it to us, which is an art and a practice and not easy.
Something that develops over time.
And a lot of fuck ups too.
Yeah.
And a lot of not seeing each other. Like sometimes when my husband and I have had fights and he'll say all these things to me, and it'll be so at odds with how I see myself or how I see what I do that I almost don't want to see it. I'll just like recoil. But I actually have a practice of, after we've had an argument, writing down what it is he's told me about myself. Because the truth is, I'm that as well. Like I'm the identity that I see myself as, but I'm also what's reflected to me by others, because I'm two-sided. I'm multifaceted. I am not this, perfect person on a pedestal. I'm not this, I've got it all figured out. There's also going to be times where I fall down too. And so I need to have the humility to be able to own where I also screw up. And this has been the biggest parenting too, is like when I get annoyed at how I see him parent, that's an invitation for me to go, okay, where do I do that? Where do I also speak in those ways?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most useful practices that I have learned from you, is making the list of, and where am I also that?
Yeah. It's funny because it's like the biggest thing that you would think would not create harmony, but does. Because the family dynamic is designed for every single person in that family to grow. And it's almost like a nervous system, in the sense that all parts are represented. So if somebody's really over-functioning, then someone's going to underfunction. Because together those two pieces create equanimity. They create the equilibrium.
Yeah.
And so
hello, mother's
sometimes
carrying everything.
Hello, mother's carrying everything. It's the same thing. Like, I mean, even today, like my husband, for us to record this, he's taken the 3 kids out, and I've given him a massive list of stuff. And in the past, I would have tried to fit that into my week. And I'm like, no, I can give that to you. I don't need to do that. I can let that go. But we also have to be willing to let that go, because sometimes we've also, in the gap created from maybe the professional, high-flying woman that we might have been in the past, or whoever we decided we were before we had children, in the gap of that and building this new part of ourselves as mothers, there can be a sense of attachment to the satisfaction of achieving all of these things. And so if I'm attached to having all of this stuff done and ownership of all these things, then I don't want to give that up because I'm attached to that. Which, was part of my challenge also with like handing over sleep stuff to my husband, because I realized how much I'd wrapped my identity in, I got our baby to sleep because it was my mothering role to do that. But that's not true. Like nothing, like it's just a belief. So we have to be willing to tussle with those things we hold as true for us to be able to understand each person in the family and understand where our partner might be coming from when we have like, a real aversion to what they're saying to us. Because really they're helping us to see beyond our own narrow perspectives. And it's just a question of whether we're willing to or want to see that.
Much to think about.
It's big. It's so big. Like it's such a big topic.
And then, like, even as you're talking, I'm going like, yep, we got to give them space to like step in and let them do that. And in the other side of my brain's going, yeah, but like, how in the divorce courts and custody sorting out arrangements, how so many men who have just been incompetent and lazy will say, well, I didn't contribute, I didn't do these things because she wouldn't let me. And being able to recognize that, sometimes it is, it could be either way,
Yeah.
Like,
and I mean,
I can't sit here and say for every person, you've just got to love harder so that they can love you more, because some people are just dicks and you've got to leave.
Totally, exactly. And like I have that advice for, like, I work with women one-to-one and in groups, and there are boundaries, and there'll be times where I say, you need to think really carefully about if this is what you want to be in, right? Because that's the truth as well, is that sometimes when the burden of responsibility gets so great, some men will collapse and they won't rise. And there's
no quicker way to add to that burden of responsibility than having children.
That's right. And having more children, which creates more responsibility. Some men rise to that and thrive on it and grow from that, and some don't, just like some women. And that's when you've got to be really honest with yourself and advocate for what you really want. And that's hard too, particularly when we look at how disenfranchised mothers can be and how financially reliant many mothers can be on a partner because of the way that our society is constructed. And on that point of, in divorce cohorts, men saying she wouldn't give me anything to do, that's also a product of, again, I touched it earlier, and I'm sure you talk about it a lot, this perfect mother myth of, you've got to be doing everything all of the time. And maybe one day you'll be this unicorn of a mother who has never dropped a ball in her life. So mothers can also run that track where they're so consumed by that sense of never being enough, according to this hallmark version of motherhood, that they are running on fumes, and to the point of depletion, and to the point of also where it's really hard to give anything to a partner because you're not giving anything.
There's literally nothing left.
Nothing left. There's nothing left. And this is the other tricky thing with relationship and parenting is, how do I see this as, almost like a democracy where everyone's needs get a seat at the table? So it's not all the children's, it's not all mine, it's not all my partner's. And sometimes that will mean that, some families will choose to do things like sleep training, or which is not my personal choice, but I also understand how there's sometimes one person or one cohort is going to have some more struggle to allow the whole to function. And this is the reality of living in a patriarchal motherhood construct where, women are trying to thrive in a less than satisfactory, or families even are trying to thrive in a less than satisfactory construction of family, which is why we have the perpetuation of these things that really aren't always developmentally appropriate, but we're trying to reconcile them within a society that doesn't really honor biological needs, for example. So it's really nuanced and tricky. And yet I have so much compassion for wherever women find themselves at in relationship when they're parenting, because it's full on. It can be full on, particularly if you don't have aligned value systems, because then you're like walking on different planets and you're battling and competing with whose needs are more important.
Big stuff, big stuff.
Not like a really rosy ending for us, but I think it's important for us to, look at what brought you together in relationship, look at what you loved before you had children together, look at how you can find a new form of that, how you can direct energy into your relationship when it feels like, because also too, we have in our life, we have an order, have order and chaos in our life all of the time. And so we tend to have order in the things that we value most, and we tend to have chaos in the things that we value the least. So if our relationship has got so far pushed down the list, below kids, below work, below the housework, below our social network, and the relationship is just right down the bottom, then there's typically going to be a level of chaos and disorder and frustration in it.
But if you make that choice to bump it up the list, then your partner doesn't necessarily have too much choice in it being dragged up theirs as well, because that's what you're starting to invest in.
Yeah. And that was certainly my experience. I mean, I experienced secondary infertility after my first child. And so that required me to really look at my own healing, look at my own struggles with intimacy, look at where I wasn't showing up and could be, look at where I was hiding in my motherhood instead of leaning into the hard parts of my relationship. And had I not had that struggle, I don't think our relationship would be as strong as it is now, because I had to pull myself into some pretty hard parts of my own story in order to build the connection in my body again and my relationship again to meet my desire for more children. I can now see the genius of that struggle, because with each child, your relationship has to grow enough to support that, to support the stretching that's required of you to have children. Because if you want to parent in a really functional family dynamic, it requires resourcing, it requires good communication, it requires support and understanding, and every child asks more of that from you. So I saw every pregnancy and birth and parenting of the child as an invitation to grow my relationship to meet that. And it was a comment that my mother made to me, was that at the time in her life when she was having us, she didn't think that her relationship with my dad could have survived 3 children. Now they're happily married, but that was a season of difficulty. And so I went into the decision to have a 3rd child as, well, this is also going to grow our relationship. Let's be curious about what form that's going to be in. Let's be curious about, how even this birth might play out, because I know this child is also here to grow us as well as explore their own life.
And that birth played out in some ways a lot like your own birth, the birth of you. And if that is a little taste tester, something that seems like a titillating little snippet to go and listen to, certainly dive back into the Nourishing the Mother archive to Bridget's birth story of her 3rd child. I think the episode is called Pearl's Birth Story. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's Pearl's birth story.
Yeah,
it might have something about ecstatic birth or something in the headline. I can't remember.
Mid 2020.
2019.
Okay, great. All right, I think we should stop there, Bridge, or else we'll just keep going and going.
We will.
I'll include the links to your website and your social media as well for those who would like to join in with the wonderful work that you do. But would you mind mentioning those as well now, Bridge, please?
Yeah, of course. So you can find out all that I do at bridgetwood.life. My main focus is the Reimagining Motherhood membership. So it's all about creating an online space where the whole woman and conscious parenting collide to empower women in motherhood. So thanks so much for having me, Anna. It was a joy.
And I know you take a sort of a new theme each month, so it's kind of like almost like a mini program each month within that membership, as well as an ongoing support space.
It is. Yeah, it's a beautiful space. And I really respond a lot to what the energy of the group is working with. And at the moment, it's rage. So timely.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for your time, Bridget. And I'll speak with you again soon.
Thanks, Anna.
Bye.
Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it and bringing it to you. If you feel called, please jump across to your podcast app and leave us a 5-star rating and a review as well if you would like. This helps other parents find us and join in with these juicy conversations that we love so much. You can also jump in and become a supporter of the podcast via the link in the show notes. And remember, you can connect with me on socials and via my website as well, www.annacusack.com. mummy.com.au, where you can see all about me, my services, and my book as well, Mummy You're Not Broken. Until next time, bye.